If you have a receiver on your fantasy football roster with 2 feet and a heartbeat, you can ill afford to sit them here. Heck, if they have 1 foot and a heartbeat, I'd even consider starting them this week. Thanks to early season injuries, we have been born into the bye weeks, molded by them. It feels like we've been preparing for these bye weeks since week number 1. Puka Nacua, Cooper Kupp, Devonta Smith, AJ Brown, Devontae Adams, Tank Dell, they were all hurt before week 4 even kicked off. Now to make matters worse, add Rashee Rice to that list. And you know what? I wish I could say it doesn't get any worse, but the fact that we have 4 teams on a bye week, the Philadelphia Eagles, Detroit Lions, Los Angeles Chargers, and the Tennessee Titans, it does get worse. We have fewer options this week. We've already adjusted for AJ Brown and Devonta Smith there because we're dealing without them last week. But now we have to find a way to replace Amon-Ra St. Brown, Jameson Williams, Joshua Palmer, Ladd McConkey, DeAndre Hopkins, and Calvin Ridley as well. Now the good news is you are in the right place as we look at which wide receivers you can trust here in week number 5 with this week's starts and sits. Here we go now. Now starting with those starts, let's talk about Michael Pittman Jr. of the Indianapolis Colts as they take on the Jacksonville Jaguars down in Duval County. It is time to give credit where credit is due. After being on the sit list for the last 3 weeks, Michael Pittman is back in the fantasy penthouse thanks to exceeding expectations with a 6-catch, 113-yard performance against the Pittsburgh Steelers last week in which he caught passes for both Anthony Richardson and Joe Flacco. It's unknown if Flacco will be under center once again here for week number 5 after Anthony Richardson left last week's contest early, or if Richardson is going to return. But we do know that Joe Flacco, he is a wide receiver one's best friend. Now, regardless of who's under center this week, the matchup against the Jaguars, it is excellent for Pittman. Jacksonville ranks as the 5th most desirable fantasy matchup for opposing wide receivers, allowing nearly 35 fantasy points per game thus far through 4 weeks. On average, the Jaguars have been allowing 15.2 receptions, 193.5 receiving yards, and a touchdown per game. With 2 of PFF's worst rated safeties in Antonio Johnson and Andre Sisco occupying that secondary for the Jaguars, expect the Colts to take plenty of shots and having success down the field. That means Alec Pierce and Josh Downs, they're excellent flex options in today's wide receiver economy. Another wide receiver I'm firing up this week. How about Amari Cooper of the Cleveland Browns as they take on the Washington Commanders in DC? There are very few things that you can trust in fantasy football more than Amari Cooper beating up on poor defenses, and which is the case here in week number 5. Washington has been the most generous fantasy opponent to wide receivers, giving up nearly 40 fantasy points per game and allowing an average of 2.5 touchdowns per game through the first 4 weeks of competition. Deshaun Watson, he has been fantasy kryptonite, but you know what? He looked good at times last week against the Raiders. It was actually Amari Cooper that kind of let that team down. Now look for an excellent bounce back this week after a disappointing week 4. However, we'd be talking a little bit differently about Cooper this week had it not been for that holding call that negated an 80-yard touchdown passing catch. Cooper may have some added incentive this week. He could be out there showcasing his talent for potential suitors as the trade deadline is just a month away, and there is a certain Super Bowl contender out there who could be looking to add after losing one of their top receivers last week. And finally, my final start of the week, how about Jayden Reed of the Green Bay Packers as they take on the Los Angeles Rams? I'm not sure if Jayden Reed is a must-start weekly option there at the wide receiver position, but as these bye weeks start to hit, he is a player who should be in your flex until further notice. Even when Jordan Love was out of the lineup, Reed was the one player the Packers found a way to manufacture touches for. Love's return to the lineup against the Vikings last week, well, it was, let's call it interesting. It started off badly and it turned out to be great. It turned out to be a fantasy manager's dream as the Packers quarterback would throw 3 interceptions and 4 touchdowns. Oh man, I miss the good old days with Jameis Winston. Anyway, in that return, it was Dontavian Wicks who had a pair of touchdown grabs, but Jayden Reed was no slouch, hauling in a touchdown of his own along with 139 yards and 7 grabs. Expect a similar performance this week against the Rams team, who are allowing the 6th most fantasy points this season to wide receivers, allowing 148 yards and nearly 2 touchdowns per game, not to mention 30.9 fantasy points. Now those sits of the week come courtesy of the Buffalo Bills. Stephon Diggs, yes, this could be one of those revenge narratives that we could be talking about, how we could work this angle, but I'm looking at the numbers and this matchup is not favorable for Texans pass catchers. Teams, they've had success running the ball against the Bills, who have injuries at their linebacker positions, but they haven't had the same success when it comes to the passing game. Entering Week 5, Buffalo is allowing just 15.5 fantasy points per game to opposing wide receivers, allowing just 9.8 receptions and 68 yards on a per-game basis. I'll tell you what, right now, I'm sure as heck not sitting Nico Collins, so Stephon Diggs, he earns that seat at that table, although he could be playing with a chip on his shoulder, since this could be one of those, hey, you know what you used to have? Yeah, well, you know what? You can't have it anymore type situations. Buffalo, they have limited some of the top talent in the league so far this season. Marvin Harrison, he had just 1 catch for 4 yards back in week number 1. In week number 2, Tyreek Hill and Jalen Waddle, back when Tua Tagovailoa was still healthy, they each were held to less than 42 yards apiece. Meanwhile, Christian Kirk was the big wide receiver against this Bills defense, hauling in 8 passes for just 79 yards back in week number 3. And last week, I'm not even sure a wide receiver caught a pass for the Baltimore Ravens. It was basically Justice Hill doing what he wanted in the passing game. Now, another wide receiver I'm seeing this week is Drake London of the Atlanta Falcons as they take on the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. We can hate the Drake all we want, but we should be thankful that the Falcons wide receiver hasn't been the Pitts. Now, last week against the Saints, Drake had 6 receptions on 12 targets for 64 yards. So why the hate this week? Well, it's about the matchups. This week's opponent, the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, is a top 7 fantasy defense so far against opposing receivers. The Bucs have yielded just 20.7 fantasy points on a per-game basis through the first 4 weeks. Tampa's defense has had that bend but do not break type approach early on, allowing 121.8 yards per game to wide receivers, but just 0.2 touchdowns per game. Fun fact, Paris Campbell is the only wide receiver with a touchdown grab against Tampa Bay this season, and I would hardly even consider him a wide receiver. While that 27% target share during the first month of the NFL calendar, it looks promising for Drake London. That 10.5 fantasy points per game in half PPR formats leaves fantasy managers yearning for more. In 70 career contests, London only has 70 or more receiving yards in 10 of those games, none so far this season. And the final sit of the week, it comes on Monday Night Football, and it's Xavier Worthy of the Kansas City Chiefs as they take on the New Orleans Saints. With the recent loss of Rashee Rice to that knee injury, it may be tempting to just kind of slot Xavier Worthy into that wide receiver role and into those vacated fantasy points. However, this week's matchup is difficult. Kansas City is hosting New Orleans on Monday night, and the Saints defense, they have only surrendered 1 receiving touchdown so far to wide receivers this season. Patrick Mahomes has, dare I say it, become a game manager. This Chiefs offense becomes even more predictable with the loss of Rice following losses of Marquise Brown and Isaiah Pacheco. If they are to have any kind of success, it's going to be in a dink and dunk type offense with Travis Kelce and Kareem Hunt there working underneath while Worthy opens up the space over the top. Perhaps Mahomes will take a shot here and there, but overall the volume, it won't be enough to consider Worthy a reliable fantasy option in season-long formats. 2 more premier wide receivers that have difficult matchups this week. Minnesota Vikings all-pro wide receiver Justin Jefferson faces a Jets secondary that is as good as it gets when it comes to Sauce Gardner, DJ Reed, and Michael Carter. New York is allowing just 8.5 receptions per game to opposing wide receivers, and this game is in London, where offenses typically go to die. And the other all-pro wide receiver with a less than favorable matchup is CeeDee Lamb, who will face Joey Porter Jr. and the Pittsburgh Steelers one-on-one. Porter has proven to be an elite shutdown defender early on in his career, so this is one of those matchups inside the matchup that I can't wait to see how it unfolds here in week number 5. And if you want to see how everything else unfolds, head to RotoBaller.com for all your latest news and analysis, and head over to the RotoBaller Discord channel where you'll find me 24/7. We'll see you there.